Before we start, I'd love just because we're trying to extend that conversation onto Twitter and have the follow-ups and create some more content and share that content and have those discussions followed on Twitter. So at the bottom of the screen there, if you chuck us a follow if you are a Twitterer. And actually a lot of the big hashtag that was trending last week when this topic came out was my arts degree, which some of you might have seen. So everybody that had a great arts degree and had done something amazing with it, including lots of politicians, were there on that hashtag showing why the government was so wrong with these views. And I'm not saying that's my view. But for this, I thought it'd be really interesting to hear. We're going to have a discussion about the intent behind the changes, as well as then the implications and whether we think it's going to have the impact it is planned to have. So just to recap, obviously Dan Tehan last week announced fee changes, that humanities, in broad strokes, that humanities degrees would go up 113%, while law and commerce would be increased as well, and that industries, degrees that predominantly led to industries, which he thinks is going to have 62% of growth, will have fee reductions. So those are, health, tech, engineering, and clinical psychology, English and languages, architecture, environmental science, all of those that fit into those categories of agriculture, tech. So he thinks those industries of healthcare, science and technology, education and construction are going to account for 62% of employment growth in the next 5 years. And has aligned what degrees automatically and directly feed into those and judged it based on that. Now they haven't, maybe someone else has got, I found it really hard to find the data that they'd used at a granular level to work that out. If anyone's seen that, just drop it in the chat, because I know in the US, obviously the World Economic Forum report goes into that absolute finite detail about at a task level, the burning glass data they use, what is it? And it seems much more refined than the broad strokes we've got about, humanities degrees. There is a slight balance to that in that it's at a unit level. So he wanted people to counter a degree that was in a low growth area with a unit from a high growth area to balance their fees out. But that's the general gist of it. And what everyone took was that, humanities degrees are seen as not in demand and therefore maybe not valuable. We want to encourage people into other areas. So just to dive into that first, I've got some questions here around the intent that we can have a discussion around. And as I say, there was just quite a small group today. So do feel free to unmute and ask questions. I'm going to jump out this slide deck so it can be in the chat. But the first one around intent, he said, it's common sense. If Australia needs more educators, more health professionals and more engineers, then we should incentivize students to pursue those careers. So the big first question is this government's job? Should they be incentivizing students financially to pursue things? And I think a lot of the careers folk, the unis came out and said, and the CDAA have come out and said, actually, that's not the government's job. What we need is more careers advice to help people navigate their own futures based on strengths, rather than taking this demand-led, okay, this is what we're going to incentivize financially. Jim, what's your view on, is that the government's role?
I think it is in part. I mean, I think most studies on voting intentions show that it's a hip pocket job, that whichever colour of government we vote for, we do it thinking that, generally speaking, our own interests are not going to be terribly damaged, or they are going to be advanced. And that thing about trust about the economy is a big thing, and it links closely to voting intentions. Governments are voted in part to be responsible in their actions with our money in the economy. So part of that job is to make sure that you are feeding the system the right kind of meat, and if there's shortages, then it is common sense. I agree with Dante, and it is common sense to incentivize. I think the devil is always in the detail with these things, and there's a big difference in my mind between an incentive and a disincentive. They're not on a continuum. So a traditional way of incentivizing particular areas is to give bursaries and scholarships. And that has always been how things have happened in universities. So people can go for those. And they're also, there's also an equity argument about that as well, that scholarships can sometimes be targeted to people who might otherwise not have access to particular courses. What it looks like from the detail that I've seen is that this is going to work in a different way, that in a sense, there's going to be very direct penalties for choosing to enroll in units which are not on the government's preferred list. And I think that is social engineering, because we're going to a situation where the Jacintas and Claudes from the leafy suburbs will be allowed to study philosophy and the humanities, underwritten by wealthy parents who perhaps themselves have humanities and philosophy backgrounds. Whereas those from more economically challenged backgrounds will be strongly encouraged or discouraged from going into those kinds of areas, and are more likely to have to follow the government's line. They're not going to have the freedom to go into these things. They'll become a rich person's preserve.
Which is pretty much going backwards to how it used to be. I think, that preserve of the elite who can afford a generalist education and to have the time to think about the big issues, and the less well-off who have to go and train to earn money and get a job.
Well, if you go back historically, you don't have to go back too far, when only 5% of the population went to university, probably 70s to about the early 80s. Then it started to open up, and then the floodgates really opened in the late 90s, 2000s, or probably even later than that. Then you only had the 5% elite that would go to universities, and it's no surprise that those universities overwhelmingly were offering sort of humanities-based subjects. Science was a bit odd, and so was even engineering. That was still more commonly pursued through technical colleges than it was through a university offering. And those elites would then end up in the sort of higher echelons of government and law and the levers of power. And the great unwashed and the riffraff were kept well at bay. Looks like we're going back to that kind of model. So if you come from some kind of upper class kind of background and you don't want to mix with the riffraff, then go and enroll in a degree in philosophy, and you'll only hang out with your private school mates and nobody else. That would be a class analysis of what's going on. But it does seem to me that it's going to immediately introduce potentially that kind of inequality. But I do think the government has got a perfectly legitimate role in trying to make sure that our numbers, we're getting the right kind of work that the economy needs. And that one of the levers of that is education. Another one is migration, which is why I'm a benefactor of the skilled migration program. That's how I got into this country.
Me too.
Believe it or not, there was a shortage of psychology lecturers. I think the same year it was psychology lecturers and hairdressers were the shortages, and I chose psychology, and that's how I got in. I was on meeting the points. So they've always used immigration as a way of topping up jobs, and we still do it now, don't we, with these special visas for people working on farms and things like that. So
well, I guess that's going to be that's the critical thing at the moment, that we're going to be so short on immigration, and particularly students, that they're going to have to boost places here, and nobody's allowed to go off and travel, obviously. And I guess because of coronavirus, is there special circumstances right now? There was, I think at the press club, they'd said, success for now, we can talk all we want about human growth and independent pathways, but success is a job. Like for the next few years, success is a job, which isn't very idealistic or optimistic, but potentially that's the reality.
I still think if they want more educators or more health professionals, I can't understand why they're just not paying them more. Like, if you want to push up the industry, why are we changing a university degree like fees, why don't we actually just, like, these industries cry out for actually pay rises on a fairly regular basis and get literally nothing. I know their unions certainly don't help them either, but I don't understand why we're affecting students who want to study in their areas. Why not actually pay the industry more, and obviously more people will possibly be drawn to it from that sort of side as well.
100%, because there's so much talk about, you know, in how do we raise the professionalism, and teachers should be held up the same as lawyers, you know, the equal training. Well, now they're going, okay, we'll make it cheaper to learn to teach and we'll make it more expensive to train to be a lawyer. But that's so short term, isn't it?
It's almost a bit of a backhanded sort of thing, though, because you're not talking about a whole lot of money in differences to study, like, but you're talking about a lifelong career in those areas. Like, you want to put more things into postgraduate study and help sort of raise the bar actually within those industries, opposed to actually, I don't know, I find it strange that, yeah,
it's almost like, what can we do to make 2021 enrollments look different rather than the long term?
Yeah,
I think it's
there's still only numbers that can go to courses as well.
Yeah,
it's a very good point, and I think there is something rather odd about this kind of process, and it also overlooks the fact that even in the most vocational of courses, the vast majority of students enrolled in those courses don't go and pursue careers under the name of the course. So 60% of engineers, last time I looked, do not go on to work in engineering, and a lot of those people get sort of sucked up into this amalgam of sort of business manager type roles. And it's interesting, if you look at the ANSCO, as I do on a daily basis, the Australian and New Zealand Standard Classifications of Occupations, brackets first edition, close brackets, you'll see lots and lots of professional specialisms like engineering, lots of flavours of different teachers, higher education teachers, TAFE teachers, primary, etc., etc. But when you get down to business, as it were, there's just this sort of very few. There's things like ICT manager, sales manager. You know, there's not anything like the subtlety of distinction. It's just all lumped together as management. And that's where a lot of people will end up if they're chasing remuneration, because those jobs often pay incredibly well. And that's where a lot of the engineers end up. And in fact, even in engineering courses, they often teach them sort of communications courses, because I think that's what they're going to end up doing. In fact, I've heard it said that very often the basic engineering work, the kind of get your hands dirty in the field engineering work, will be done by graduates from third world countries, because they can be trained cheaper and their salary expectations are lower. So most engineers graduating from Australian universities should expect to go into a management type role. So it makes a bit of a mockery of this when a lot of the people aren't actually going to end up in the field. You know, 3 times as many lawyers are in training as in practice, for instance. But that doesn't mean that law is not incredibly valuable. You look at the board, look at the, you know, I mean, Liv, you're the Miss Corporate. Look at boards, you know, what do you have on them? Accountants, sales and marketing people, lawyers. That's pretty much makes up most boards. And possibly these days there's a token HR person. But generally speaking, it's those hard facts about how businesses run. And those people come from a wide range of different areas to get into that kind of position. So the assumption that people just go off and follow the degree, and even if they do, teaching's a good one. Here we are, all the teachers here. We've got, how many of you in the room? I've only got 5 faces here. Put your hand up or wave manically if you've been in the profession more than 5 years. 1 of you, 2 of you. So only 2 of you been teachers for 5 years or more. The rest of you are new to the profession. That's interesting.
40.
I have, but I left again.
You left. Well, on the stats saying now that new teachers last about 5 years before they burn out, get disillusioned and go.
I was in it for 12 years and then, left. So.
Yeah. So, you know, even in very vocational areas where you've done a degree which is tightly linked and you've done placements which are tightly linked to the workplace that you're going to go into, even there you see huge turnover, you know, so it seems a very odd way of trying to increase the efficiency of the market.
There's also the question of what's the responsibility of business to train people in the vocational aspects. Most employers, the message we get as careers teachers is that employers want multi-skilled people, and that the actual vocational skills for a particular profession are the least important of the generic skills to them. They want people who can communicate and work in teams and all of those things. And I wonder if business and government have actually been talking at all here, because it seems to go against everything we've been told.
Yes.
You know, Mandy, that's a really great point. And I remember vividly an incredibly awkward meeting with field supervisors when I first arrived at UNSW in the psychology department. And they were the employers who would come in and very kindly take our psychology master's students on placement to get experience. And around that table in 1995, there was a real division. And we had people from for instance, the Australian Army and people from the Commonwealth Bank arguing, just give us bright people. We've got the resources to train them in the way we want them. We just want good critical thinkers. And then we had people from much smaller businesses, small recruitment firms and things like that, saying, no, we haven't got the time, we haven't got the capacity, we need them to have these very clear skills, and we need to be confident that you're giving these skills. And all the time I was involved in that program, I had this constant sort of battle or having to weigh up the needs of different sorts of employers. Because you're right, they don't all need the same thing. And some actually, I mean, in fact, the Army said to me at the time, and I can't speak for them now, they said, the last thing we want is a bunch of lecturers who don't really understand our needs, training people up in stuff, which we then have to spend all the time getting them to unlearn, so they learn it in the way that we want them to. I've heard psychologists say that about year 12 psychology as well, mind you. So there is a variation in terms of what employers want in all of this. It does seem, there's another broader issue here. And I want to say, by the way, I'm speaking from a personal perspective. I'm not representing ACU in my comments here. I should have said that at the beginning. But it also says, what is this telling people? What does this signal about what a university is? Mm-hmm. And why is it okay for kids, why is it okay for the community to pay for people's education up to year 11 and will indulge them if they want to stay the extra year to year 12, and they don't have to justify that and they don't have to pay it back? But why suddenly, when they become deemed nominally an adult, they are obliged to pay for all of their own professional development and have to pay it back? Why is it that school, high school and before, is seen as somehow building capacity for the economy and for culture and the society as a whole, yet universities aren't? Universities are simply there for selfish self-development projects. So where's that philosophy? Why is it that suddenly you've got this user must pay back at that level, whereas we don't have it before? And secondly, when does it become the case that universities are just degree factories? They're basically glorified TAFEs that just pour out skilled graduates with a set of defined competencies, as opposed to giving people an opportunity to explore themselves, to learn how to think critically and independently, and to engage in divergent thinking.
Well, let's see. I'll launch the poll, and I think that's a really good point. It's like, what is the important role of universities? What's the most important out of those things? You know, is it about the economy? Is it about individuals, or is it about critical thinkers?
No brainer.
Yeah.
It's a bit of push polling I've done there, but
it was. You weren't supposed to say all your views before before we launched that.
But I do think it's. I mean, I think a lot of things are I think a lot of things are making universities sort of think. Or people are thinking what our universities are about. I mean, we're getting to a stage now where people like Apple have got their own Apple University, and some of these big companies have got turnovers bigger than some countries now. And they're, Google's and all these sort of IT techie companies are more than capable of training up their own people in their own way. And they don't have any obligations to share what they're doing publicly. They can do it privately for competitive advantage and the rest of it. And we're also seeing now this notion of these micro-credentials, these small little courses are going on. Somebody said in this debate that they said vocational education has won the war. I mean, the vocational education sector has pushed and pushed and pushed to give ever higher levels of qualification. They can now give out vocational diplomas, so they can get up to diploma level. So it's not far off degree level. And before soon, we're going to get to that stage where they'll be offering those sorts of qualifications. What distinguishes it what's the difference between technical education and university education? And when I put that to Liv earlier, she put one back to me. She said, well, what would you do with medicine? And I've said, for people always think I'm joking when I say this, and I think I've said it in one of these forums a couple of weeks ago. I see medicine, particularly surgery, as probably just an advanced elective on after hairdressing, or possibly plumbing. You would do surgery. It's really a TAFE course. If you're a plumber, you can basically do surgery. What's the difference? And you know, hairdressers used to do surgery. You're learning a series of techniques. You know, you don't go in to have your gallbladder removed, to have 5 surgeons sitting around debating whether reality exists and whether it exists if I leave the room and don't perceive it. They're not there to think as philosophers. They're there to follow a set of procedures very closely and carry out the thing. How is that different to a carpenter or a plumber? You know, I mean, but we've put this status on things like medicine because it's life-saving. But equally, you know, plumbing can be life-saving if you've got a massive flood, or electricians can kill you if they wire it up wrong. So should we be moving those courses to TAFE? What would happen then if you put medicine and its specialities into TAFE?
There'd be a revolution.
Yeah.
This is how they broke TAFE. This is how they broke vocational education, by messing around with what was a valuable qualification and what wasn't, by saying all these qualifications. I remember I think it was Birmingham at the time, standing up and saying, we don't need all these art therapists. You know, that this was a useless thing to do. Not that he actually knew what art therapists were or where they might work in the massive aged care sector, but that kind of judgment and changing the pricing so that it is so obscure that nobody can work it out, and making some courses more expensive than others, that's actually broken TAFE completely. And this is now what they want to do with university. This frustrates me so much. And, you know, it's a nice thought that we could put some things back into TAFE. TAFE's already offer degrees, but you pay 3 or 4 times the amount to do one. So I don't know why anybody would bother. So there's a whole lot of issues there about the funding of everything, and starting with TAFE, that needs to be fixed. Vocational education needs to be fixed, and universities, I don't understand why we can't just, if we must charge anything, and I agree that it's not something that should be charged, if we must charge, why can't we charge the same for every course and then incentivise the ones that we want to do a little bit of social engineering about, and rather than disincentivising things that are useful? Because one of the things that strikes me too is that I'm not a psychologist, so I don't know this, but my impression from years of careers counselling is that people don't change their interests and talents much, and it's not something you can force on somebody. You really often are compelled to follow what you're able to do and what you love doing, or what you at least like doing. And I don't want a nurse looking after me who did it because the course is cheap.
Yeah, I think that's massive. I think is it going to have any impact at all on the students, like in terms of decision making? Will it actually change someone's mind, or will it just make things harder in the long run?
Yeah, I'd be interested to know what others who work in schools think, because granted, I work in a elite girls' school, so I'm in that bracket. But when I've had these discussions with people have said that students don't make their university decisions based on what it costs because of HECS and the fact that, you know, an 18-year-old's not thinking that far ahead, or whatever it is. So, the discussions I've had with people are, you know, is this really going to have any effect at all? Because the students are going to make their decisions based on other factors. And I completely agree with you, Mandy. Trying to force people into, triangles, into circular pigeonholes or whatever, it just, it goes against what I think we should be doing is, as careers educators, is, finding the right you know, fitting people
Passion.
into the right places sort of thing, or urging them to go in the direction where their skills and their interests are, rather than what's cheaper. Yeah.
I did wonder why we need all those psychologists in future.
Yes. I was really surprised at that.
I think you need this one, and there's a couple of points I'd make there. Is one about people's changing interest. Well, actually they do, and the evidence is their interests do change. And Tony Borg, my PhD student, teacher up in the Hunter Musselbrook area, showed in longitudinal studies quite convincingly that people's about 50% of his sample changed their interests from year 12 to first year university. And if you look at the dropout rates at university, about 40% change course in the first year, and that's not because of inadequate career teaching. Don't blame the career teachers because these people have changed courses. They changed because they've been exposed to things they never thought they'd be exposed to.
Exactly, they've just opened their eyes to so much more.
Yeah, that's right. I think there was a debate on the. Sorry, just a final point. There was a debate on the ABC yesterday. Some guy was on there saying that the vice chancellor, when he went to university, said, and in the first year, hold on to your sexuality, your sexual orientation, and hold on to your degree course, because you'll be exposed to so many different possibilities. You get very confused. And that was the vice chancellor of I can't remember which university it was. She gave this address to the students, saying that you will be so radically challenged by change. I wanted to make one other point briefly, just to address Rowena's point before we, sorry to dominate a bit, but Rowena, that point about not picking courses because of the cost of them, I worry about families who are first going to university, and their family members may well have no idea about university other than picking up on pricing signals about courses, who might actively dissuade their family members from picking particular courses because they know they're going to be saddled with huge debt. Whereas perhaps in families where multiple generations have gone to university, they're more relaxed about that because either the family itself has got resources to assist the student, or they're confident that student will ultimately be able to manage that debt that they're going to have. I have no data for that, but I think that's it's plausible that could be the case. Sorry,
I can only imagine that the people whose decision might be changed by this won't be the privileged elites who multi-generation uni, we all go, it won't be those people, which means that in those media, commerce, law, there will be less diversity than there is now even.
Yeah, you're right.
I agree though, Rowena. I think that students are not thinking about cost when they're choosing their degree at year 12. I think that they're thinking that's a long way off before I have to pay it back. So it's not one of their primary, decision-making ideas. So, but I guess from a career practitioner's perspective though, I feel very much like we have this dilemma of how much do we encourage them to choose these degrees that are very, very expensive, knowing that they may not be able to afford it. And so we are almost at how do we counsel when we perhaps know that an arts degree may be a really great pathway for them to sort of start exploring first, but knowing that it's so expensive. And so do we dissuade them from an arts degree and actually try and sort of encourage them in other areas?
I think one of the key decision-making things that we should be teaching, like as they go through life, they're going to have to be able to make those judgments on what is the return on investment of this piece of learning. And I absolutely think we should make it more explicit and teach people to work out, okay, I'm going to make this investment, whether it's a time investment or a financial investment, I'm going to make this, or even an identity investment. And actually make it more explicit that this is a thing. It might not change their mind, but it is actually a really important factor. And you see it in the US. I think I never expected in the US to have such a backlash, but I think they're going to change faster than ever. This kind of everyone goes to college and we don't talk about anything until we go to college, because the debts are so huge and the underemployment and unemployment is such an issue that there's actually a real backlash there. And I think we should be almost encouraging that early, that let's not go everyone goes to uni at no cost, don't worry about it until later, but actually teach them how to think about that.
I think one of the things which I think is quite disturbing is those of us who've got long memories. Do you remember we had a Prime Minister many, many years ago called Malcolm Turnbull? Anyone remember him?
Yeah.
First
When
time or
was-
the second time round?
when was that, last year or the year before? And didn't we have something called the creativity agenda, that we wanted to be the creative nation?
The innovation agenda. Yeah.
Innovation agenda. And, you know, suddenly, same party, same government, essentially, and within a couple of years, absolute volte-face on that one, and the arts are gone. In one sense, that's a view to be optimistic, and it might be strategic to say go into the arts, because these decisions will get reversed, possibly even by the same political party, depending on who happens to be in the chair at the time, or possibly by a different party. And equally, if the numbers of art students drop dramatically, then presumably for those who do graduate, their employment prospects go up because there's less competition. So there's an argument there. There's also another argument. If you really want to believe the government that, you know, all these arts people are just layabout dropouts writing poetry and they're unemployable, never get any work, brilliant. Go off and do an arts degree, because you'll never have to pay it back. Wonderful, because you're never going to earn any money to be able to do it. You'll have sort of low-paid jobs, so go and do your arts degree. Also, I think universities, if they're smart, and I feel like ANU are already saying this, they're going to say, wow, if I can get these big fees from government for the arts courses, then that's the way I'm going to go. I'm going to enroll as many art students as I possibly can, and I'm going to market like crazy. And if all these students, as Rowena and Helen are saying, aren't price sensitive, they're going to get seduced by the arts. And we might end up with even more art students. Wouldn't that be wonderful?
Yeah, I think that's what
That's
Julie
crazy.
came out with, didn't she? She said ANU will 100% change the strategy to attract more arts and humanities, because that's what pays. Because in the detail, unis will get $5,000 less for a science and engineering degree than they will for arts and humanities.
And bear in mind that science degrees cost a hell of a lot of money. You know, the stats that came out a couple of years ago about Sydney University has basically been subsidising its medicine degree with its arts enrolments, because it costs so much to mount those courses. The fees that they've been allowed to charge don't cover the cost of the training. So there is that issue there too, that science courses cost a lot more money to put on, and technology courses cost a hell of a lot more money than you know, dusting off an old copy of Shakespeare and writing poetry. Sorry, I'm being dismissive of the arts. Shouldn't say that.
The HEX system, when it started, they told us that it was about the cost of the courses, and then they immediately put law into the highest band. And so you could only assume that they assumed that law was going to have the greatest payback, therefore they would get their money back faster and so forth. So, you know, you have to be cynical about there being any system to it. I know my daughter did her nursing degree when it was, you know, $1,000 cheaper than anything else to do, but she wanted to do it anyway, so that was fine. But you can't, you know, they try to pretend that there's some basis behind this, where really they're just, if COVID's taught us anything, is that things can change really quickly. And what I believe they're doing is simply replacing international students with some high student number, cheap courses that can bring in as much funding to universities so the government doesn't have to pay any more. And I am very cynical.
I think they've got to be very careful with this as well, because if you really wanted to get a government out of power, just stop all the kids going to university and get them signed on with unemployment. I mean, if these people didn't go to university, the unemployment statistics would go through the roof. So actually, having people in courses is long been used to keep people off dole queues. So it'd be politically unacceptable, I think. And I think they are messing around with it, and they're around the edges. Why? I mean, you talk about incentives like paying teachers more. Another incentive, why don't they just impose lower ATAR scores on universities and say, you know, you have got to take law or whatever it happens to be, the course du jour, with ATARs of 70 or something, as opposed to 95. You want more psychologists, don't make the ATAR 95. The ATAR's got nothing to do with the complexity or difficulty of the subject. I can tell you
Exactly.
that. Yeah, from the
The
inside
demand.
point of view. Yeah, exactly. It's there as a demand management device. Fiddle with that, and it's incredibly sensitive to that. If you
Oh,
want
fiddle
to
with the
ignore more
English
of that,
score. If you really
Yeah,
want to do it,
yeah.
fiddle with the English score, because that's like, if you're talking about what's going to stop kids getting into courses, it's English scores, really.
Yep.
It'll be interesting to see. My husband's niece is in Rockhampton, and they've just already got their university offers for year 12. So she wanted to study to be a speech therapist at the university at Rockhampton, and the principals wrote support letters for the students. They identified what course they wanted to do, and she's already got an acceptance. So it'll be very interesting to see. It'd be great to be able to track those students to see how many of them stay in their course and the success they have, because then you could do away with ATAR scores.
Completely.
Well, is it conditional, or is it actually just, because I still thought there was some conditions attached to those, like even if they were.
I don't know. She was just talking about it last night, and that was the general gist of it. So there might be someone else in Queensland that knows more about that. But yeah, I know that's
I thought there were 2 unis going unconditional already. But I can't remember.
UNE.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, obviously Canberra University. But yeah, there's like La Trobe's just put out a new thing that they're running, actually, where you can actually partake in a subject either starting in July or November this year that will actually literally cancel out your English score. And that will actually get you straight into university next year with La Trobe University. So, which I just find extraordinary. Like, our students don't have enough to do in the second half of this year, let alone do another subject potentially in July, which will take up to 3 months, or start in November. Yeah, nice idea, but just like, are we just going to throw away this year for year 12 and just concentrate on that? Which just seems absurd.
I think some of these things, it would be really interesting to see how they come out. I mean, I was reflecting on subjects like psychology, which sit on the cusp of arts and science, and you have people from both coming in and attracted to the subject. When you start looking at filling up your timetable with sort of minor subjects, under this new system, the students are actually going to be discouraged from taking, they're doing a psychology major, for instance, but discouraged from taking art subjects as subsidiary subjects, which would actually be cheaper to teach. It'd be more efficient to have those students do art subjects, which in a sense they're doing out of interest just to fill up their timetable, than to have them enrolled in really expensive lab-based, IT-based courses. And it would probably make absolutely negligible difference to their employability at the end of the day, which of those minor subjects they take. So universities are suddenly going to be, if this stuff is successful, this price signaling works, is going to have people possibly fiddling around with these minor subjects more than the major ones. I take your point that if they're interested in something, they'll do it regardless of the price point. But it might be these other ones, these subtle effects of getting these big enrollments of these, if you like, just sort of fair weather travelers in courses, because it's a cheaper course to take. So so they don't compromise on the major, but they might start compromising on what they make up the rest of their program with. And it could cost universities a lot of money.
They can also apparently take English and languages for negligible amounts. So why English? Why is English singled out? Like, you could spend your whole English course doing obscure English literature, medieval something or other, which I'm sure is not what Dan Tan intends, but that's what an English course is at university. It's not generally learning to speak English.
Yeah. Yeah, I think I found some of them bizarre, and that's why it's strange that the data hasn't been released at that level. I just haven't found it.
No,
like where was the unit mapping? Where was the growth? And if they're saying science and technology or healthcare, like humanities, when you look at the World Economic Forum jobs data and where the growth is, it just doesn't match. Like, everyone's been talking in K-12, everyone talks about, human skills and tech skills are the growth areas. And, there's been such a massive push in K-12 to the general capabilities and how do we teach critical thinking, creativity. And it's like, this goes against all of that. It just doesn't make much sense at all.
Yep.
Although Liv, I'd like to challenge you because as a science graduate myself, I kind of balk against this polarization that the arts do critical thinking and problem solving, and the science just do push around test tubes and do things like that. I think there's critical thinking across so many courses, and I think what I sort of have reacted against in a way is this whole idea that if you're doing an arts degree, you're thinking in a certain way, whereas a science degree thinks in a different way. And to some degree it is correct, but it's, you know, science is so much about problem solving and critical thinking and creativity. So yeah, I just wanted to say that was,
I take that. And I think it's, you know, in K-12 we talked about a real integrated approach and those skills that blend all those. So it's almost the divorcing of the downgrading of that in relation to humanities. I find really strange when it's such a rich source of that in K-12, when we're talking about, you know, how do we build those skills and what subject areas do we really build those skills in? Absolutely science and, you know, design thinking, experimentation, that's all of that, and creativity and innovation comes from absolutely both sides. But when we're talking about, you know, the way of the future is, you know, the human skills that are really important. You know, if we talk about AI and the philosophy related to that in the growth areas, and the data science, the philosophy, the humanities understanding and the human understanding to actually do great data analysis, it's that blending, and rather than one or the other.
yeah.
And I think in K-12 there's such an elevation of that, and people striving to deliver that. And it seems like this for unis is going completely the opposite way.
I think that raises another topic which is almost broader than this. I take Rowena's point completely, because I mean, I started off as an engineer, and I remember my Dean of Engineering very keen on getting engineers to do a foreign language, because they said they're going to be working internationally and so forth, and he added those things. But trying to get people to do, the way universities are set up at the moment with sort of faculty divisions, there's inherently competition between these for, you know, brightest graduates and the rest of it. So you do end up with this science versus arts thing a little bit happening because of the way that universities are structured. So if you wanted to have innovative courses where you had sort of people in the humanities offering stuff on design thinking and creativity with input from the sciences, so you could have a real blend of those ideas, those things are quite operationally difficult to put together. And this kind of funding, which sort of picks winners, doesn't encourage that kind of collaboration. And, you know, I think if you look at a lot of the stuff about design thinking, that's a classic example where you've got people with fine arts backgrounds mixing with computer scientists without any difficulty at all. And that's what the employment reality is in many situations. And on the other hand, you've got those engineers I was talking about before who move away from engineering into more general management, sitting alongside arts graduates who've done the same sort of thing. And what they have in common, as Rowena says, that critical thinking. That's what's come out of the university for all of those students, regardless of the program they've gone through.
So what do we, what's the implications for current students, for your current students?
I'd still like to think students will do what they want to do, regardless of what it's going to cost them to go to university. Let's follow the passion, like Mandy was saying earlier.
Have any parents panicked about it or talked about it?
Not yet.
No, we're on holidays down here, so.
Yeah.
I work in two Catholic boys' schools in the inner city, and one of them is from a lower, really much lower socioeconomic group. And my feeling is that students are pretty clueless, no matter how many times I present it to them, pretty clueless about how HECS works. And you know, explaining the complexities of 11 different levels of repayment is way beyond their need to know. It'd be nice if they were all really on top of it, but they're not going to work that out. And nobody goes into a law degree thinking, how am I going to pay this back if I don't become a lawyer? Because they all think they're going to be a lawyer. And then they realise that they don't want to be, 50% of them. So it's just not a decision you can really make in year 12. You don't have the life skills, the life experience, and you can really only follow your nose and do the thing that you're interested in at the moment. and be prepared to change if something better comes along. And that's probably the whole basis of
and
counselling.
And careers, exactly. That is my agenda for careers counselling precisely, is teaching people how to make decisions, how to duck and dive, how to improvise, and how to spot opportunities. And I think that's important. I smiled, Maggie, at your philosophy. I had supper in London about a year ago with a guy called Graham Douglas, who was in a band called Eddie and the Hot Rods, who had a big hit in 1977 with "Do Whatever You Want to Do." It was an early punk song. So it's good to hear that Eddie and the Hot Rods philosophy still alive and well in 2020.
But interestingly enough, in the UK, do they still actually apply for their university courses before, like in like almost year 11, for want of a better class? Like, so they've got the whole system running that we're possibly trying to jump onto the bandwagon with at the moment, with actually having to wait for your end of school results and that supportive sort of process and stuff. So, like, is this possibly an opportunity for us to maybe move in that direction a better? Actually, I know it makes it even earlier to probably make decisions, but at least
as someone who's been through the British system and with family still going through that system, yes, they do need to apply. They apply right at the beginning of the equivalent of year 12. So they're making decisions in year 11. They're going to open days in year 11, and then they apply. And then it's their conditional offers. So, for example, when I applied, I got 3 conditional offers, and I accepted one, and I had the other as a reserve. And then I just had to wait for my results to see where I got into, and sort it all out when my results came in, which was quite frenetic when the actual results came in, of, like speaking to the universities and trying to work out what you can and can't do and what you're going to do. But I do think it's quite a positive way of doing it, because it does give you time to work towards something. The negative, I guess, is having to make those decisions so early. Having said that, the approach to university in the UK is so different. We actually just had, in my Careers and Enterprise class, we just had a professor. He was the first professor of masculinity in Perth, and he was talking us through his career and how and why he made the decisions that he did. And one of my students asked him what the purpose of university was, which I thought was a lovely question. And his response was that he doesn't like what university's become, that it's become too vocational, it's become too focused on making people job ready. And actually what university should be is, it should be time to be curious, and people who should go to university are those people who are curious, and it doesn't matter what you study, you just need to be curious. And that's much more the experience I had in the UK. I studied a degree in history, and 70% of my course went into finance or law, because you're just not expected to do a vocational degree in the UK. You're expected to do something that you enjoy, and that means you have an extra 3 or 4 years to decide what you actually want to do, and then convert it at the end. And it means that you produce a much more well-rounded group of people. And my challenge now with advising my students is, do I take that genuine belief I have that university should be an experience and for growth, and say do what you want, screw the debt as such, or do I take a more sensible, I guess, Australian, for want of a better descriptor, approach of saying, well, let's look at your potential outcomes and the debts and where it's going to take you and that sort of thing, and make that decision. It's a tough one, and I do like the way that they do it in the UK, but we can't change. We seem to be going in the opposite direction, if anything.
Can I respond to that? I'll see your university education, and I'll raise you to when I went through the university education in the 80s in Britain, coming from as a son of a judge from a very middle class family. I was given housing benefit that paid my rent. I was allowed to have full unemployment benefit during the Easter and summer vacations, which allowed me to go to the Nice Jazz Festival. I had a student grant, which I did not have to pay back at the end of that process. And that's not that long ago. I'm not that old. And that was available to all students in England. The one thing I was trying to find when you were talking there, Naomi, is I read somewhere very recently that English universities are toying, but it's just a COVID reaction or it's a long-term thing, with actually changing that system, that offers will be made after results are out. So, because I think apparently it disadvantages particular groups of society, the research has shown. So
Yeah, I think that's to do with various schools. So some schools, particularly, you know, the private schools and the higher achieving schools, they have the setup and the experience to help students apply earlier, and they have those kind of systems in place. So yeah, that is something that I had heard too. I haven't looked into it in depth, but that would be my feeling on where it would come from. Yeah.
But otherwise, I endorse your statements about English university. It's quite a different thing, and the fact people move away from home.
Well, yes, that's it. You know, I've long said in the UK, when I was a teacher in the UK, I encouraged every single student to go to university because you had nothing to lose. Yes, you did come out with a debt. You know, when my brother did it, he came out with a debt of 12 grand, which, you know, it's not small,
No.
and that's pounds as well, so double that for dollars. But he just had such an experience, and he grew up so much because he lived away from home, and he's doing something completely different now, but it doesn't matter. He's still paying the debt off, as am I, actually. So you know, so it can be tough, but it's here I wouldn't do that because you don't get that experience necessarily of living away from home, and because they do focus so much on whether your degree is applicable. You know, it's much harder to decide whether to advise a student to go to university or not.
I think that's an important point, because if you see university as a place to go for self-exploration, to be curious and to grow, you wouldn't be making your choices as they do in Australia on the basis of public transport. And you know, it horrifies me that seems to be one of the major reasons why, you know, I mean, I used to be at UNSW. Where do they recruit from? The leafy suburbs or the eastern suburbs of Sydney, and if they were lucky, they would fight amongst Sydney to get some of the upper North Shore leafy suburbs people. And some from the southern shire, but not many because they go to Wollongong. And it was pretty much like that. And, you know, Northern Beaches kids go to Macquarie University. You know, why is that? You know, it's based on public transport. It's ease of getting there because they don't even contemplate living away because they can't, because the funding's not there for it.
Yeah. In Perth, I think it's down to which one has the most beautiful view from the campus.
Yes, exactly. It just changes the whole basis of it. I remember going to City University in London, and it had a bar and a student union. I've never seen one before, and I wanted to go there for that reason. That was my basis for choosing. I didn't go there in the end, but that's why I wanted to go there.
Yeah.
My students have a preference for university in the centre of the city, if at all possible, usually RMIT or Melbourne, because they like their city kids, and they like, you know, even if they live in the burbs, they think the city's the place to be. So it's, again, not really good reasons for deciding on a university. And then when they go, they don't open themselves up to new experience. They go for their lecture and they go home. They don't stay around chatting in the student union, which has now become a whole set of franchised shops. So why would you bother? There's no cheap food. They just go home and they hang out with their friends from school. They just don't even grow up at university in this country anymore. It's really
I think a lot have to work full time as well, don't they? That's the other thing. They're doing.
A lot of them work pretty much full time. Yeah.
So what are we thinking? A good thing or a bad thing?
So bad.
Have I seen any nods, any positives? Nothing. Oh, wow, that is absolutely unanimous.
I'm writing letters to senators in the hope that they don't pass it.
Yeah,
so that's my best bet.
Yeah, and I think the CDAA have lodged something. I've seen so many like official letters, and I think just keep writing. But as we said, I don't think it is going to make any difference. And I think there's more to come with the senior secondary pathways review. And it's really hard to look at this in isolation from what they're going to do with the whole vet sector. So
I think this.
I must say,
Go on, Maggie.
Go on, Maggie.
I must say I was gobsmacked about what you said before about the fact that the universities will get paid less for those courses, that they're actually going to reduce the fees. I just assumed that, like, I'm not even sure what I thought, how that was going to roll out and stuff like this, but I assumed they would still have been given the same amount of money, and actually they were going to reduce the amount just to actually encourage students to get in there. But that's just almost giving them a kick in the ribs at the moment, while they literally are almost down anyway. Like, it's strange.
Let me I'll share the link if I can find it now, because it was all the different chancellors, and it was one of them just had gone through all the detail, and it's just like, it's not as simple as this, because they've come out and said, oh, well, the unis will still get 100% of the funding. He said it's not the case when you dig into the detail. I'll send through those with the, I'll send through some links on the bottom of the email after. But
good.
yes. But yes, congratulations to Naomi on your new job.
Thank you.
So Naomi's just moved into the role, and what's your official title?
Workforce Transition Coordinator. But at the moment it's 0.4, and then the rest is teaching. But they've said that there's room for it to be a 0.6 or possibly even a 0.8 if I can prove that the careers education needs expanding, which I will do.
It's interesting. Sorry, go on.
I was just asking Naomi, is that job at a university?
No, in a high school.
High school, okay.
Yeah, we've only about 30% of our students go on to university, do it immediately. I'm sure that there are many more of them that go on to it later on in life. We're sort of, that's why we call it a workforce transition coordinator, because it's, I mean, it's a mixture of workforce transition and also post-compulsory education.
Yeah. Cool.
And I assume at your school that the maths and English teachers also started on 0.4 and had to justify their existence to get a full equivalent position. I assume careers were not
the case.
Obviously.
I mean, it's interesting. I don't want to get too sort of political within our own industry, but we have to. I think some commentators have to be a bit careful about getting strident about saying students should be allowed to follow their own views and do what they want on the one hand, and then take contracts from the government to promote military careers or run seminars on. And you know, there's a bit of a balancing act there. I think that if you can, on the one hand, take money from government departments to promote particular career pathways, and on the other hand, try to argue that students should be left unfettered to follow their own things, then what are you doing in trying to interfere and influence those students? So I thought that there's a bit of an ethical dilemma there, I think, for some people in relation. One thing we haven't covered, which is not really our sort of focus, I suppose, is I don't know what the numbers. Does anyone know what the numbers are? What percentage of mature age students make up the undergraduate population now? I know it's gone up a lot, and it varies from university to university.
No,
but I haven't got the figures, but I've got a feeling they make up a fairly hefty proportion of the, like maybe 25%. Don't quote me on that, but I've got a feeling that the mature age student is now a very significant factor to consider in all of this. And I know it's not the immediate issue for many of us in our professional work, but I think if the students at year 12 aren't price sensitive, I would imagine the mature age student is far more likely to be price sensitive, and so they might be disproportionately affected by this or influenced by this, perhaps.
Women will.
Women, yeah, absolutely. I think so. I mean, it's
implications. If you've got a $15,000 debt from your university days, and you've got a lot more to pay back than, I'm sorry, the bloke who's an engineer, how is that fair?
Yeah. Okay, so the over 25s in 2018, according to ABC figures, were 40%.
Oh, 40, wow, okay. Wow, that's huge then. It's almost, that's an enormous number. But it's interesting, you talk about the women's experience of university, mature age women. One of my favourite movies I talk about a lot in training is a very contemporary reference to a little potboiler called Educating Rita, which filmed in 1982. That's all about a woman trying to find herself and find her freedom through education, and against great resistance, including from her rather traditional narrow-minded husband. So for women who are trying to escape situations which are suboptimal, who maybe have never been encouraged by their families for traditional reasons to expect to go to university, or wanting to get independence in their career as a way of perhaps asserting their freedom from a less than optimal situation, whether it's work or whether it's partnership, marriage, whatever, they're going to they're going to find this is going to be a barrier. You're right, Mandy. I think that's an important issue, and I didn't realise it's 40%. They're not all 40% are women, of course, but
yeah, and it's kind of, their measurement is kind of funny. So don't quote me on that. I'm still looking.
It's very difficult to know. I mean, do we want to go back to the halcyon days of, you know, punting up and down the river and sort of Brideshead Revisited and sort of this bastions of tremendous sort of privilege? Is that really what we want, or are those days over? And in which case, it goes back to that thing about purpose. Is it just about curiosity? I would have thought, if we're, as a society, if we're trying to educate, if we're trying to have a civilized society and an educated society, then people should have the freedom to be able, within reason, to follow their interests, as long as their interests aren't murdering people. And they should have the ability to pursue their curiosity and to ask questions. That's got to be to the benefit. I mean, what's the difference between a scientist and a comedian? They both ask questions. Jim Owen asks questions on stage and turns it into something amusing. He observes things and then turns it on its head. A scientist will ask a question and maybe turn a theory on its head and find something new. All of these things enrich us. And I think a civilized society needs to encourage that right across the board, that level of curiosity and that freedom to be able to express the talents that people have got. I'm getting on my soapbox a bit now. I'll stop.
No, I think that kind of sums up the feeling in the room.
It'd be interesting to know, like within those statistically, how many of those are actually immigrants that are actually just trying to upskill their actual education actually here within Australia, and also like a lot of those that are potentially second gen immigrants that have actually left school and couldn't get in and then have actually gone back later as well. So yeah.
They're saying 2 out of 5 of those mature students haven't had a bachelor's degree before, so it's maybe
okay.
I just wanted to share. Sorry, just wanted to share my experience as a point of interest. Seeing we're talking about this, I actually didn't go to university until I was in my 40s for my first degree, and so I did a psychology degree in my 40s and completed that, and then went on to do some postgrad as well. But I started off leaving at the end of year 11, went into corporate training, and I became a manager within my corporate training field, and that's sort of where I guess most of my working life before I sort of had children, and then following lots of different other pathways, went to university for the first time in my 40s. And so I don't know whether it was a generational thing. I did come from a migrant family, so nobody in my family had been to university before. It was all about getting out there and working. I had my mum was a single parent, and so I felt the need to go out and actually earn some money. So I guess it was a very different time back then. But I can certainly see how, people don't always have the opportunity when they're, 18 to be able to go to university. And I can see why those figures are so high, because that was certainly my experience. So I just wanted to share my experience to say that it is very much still a reality.
Yeah. No, thanks for that. I think I think it's very different with the context as well. And I think, increasingly, I think as these reports come out and the pressure increases on tertiary in general and the economy, I think that uni is the answer, is path A, and everything else is secondary will increasingly be questions. And I think this is the start of them pushing that for right or wrong. And I can see positives and negatives for both, but I think the selective course and engineering of that is probably not the way forward. And I don't think it's going to work either from our discussion today.